So she knew what happened. They're waiting as a team. Oh, okay. Yeah. Next to she's gone too. Take on. The Charlotte burnt me, so I did not. Huh? Charlotte.
Crunchy.
Nice medium of that. Indy's got a load of flags. Love that.
What?
Got loads of flags in your house.
Nice.
Oh, me too. It was good. I know. And the alternative is
legs flapping. It's really necessary.
That's it. I love this.
You drive the lorry. Well written over that.
Auf geht's! Drei A, 3B. Auf geht's zum Haus. Der große Stamm. Aus aktiver Hinterhand heraus diese tolle Galoppade bei diesem Pferd zu beobachten. Wasser bereitet ihm auch keine Probleme.
Das haben aber viele gesagt, dass die Linie blöd war, so wie die Sprünge standen.
Zum letzten Sprungzug und dann ins Ziel und dann haben wir auch hier die letzte Reiterin gesehen.
Haben wir das mit dem Handgaloppen vereinbart? Ja, alles nur so drauf. Ja. Aber nicht so aufgepasst, hast du gesehen.
Platz. Gegner Niederwern, Max Volk mit Lotzi. Die Programm Nummer 35, Werte 7,2.
24.30. So we have our second competitor forward. This is our sole representative from Thailand. Thailand being represented this year by Nina Ligan. Nina, who rides her own and her mother Pan Ligan's Jazz King. They are ranked number 67 in the world and come to us on an overnight score of 102.1, good enough for 34th position. Nina Ligan, Jazz King, Thailand.
I was young, I didn't know all that I could be. Then you found me, you read aloud and showed me how a man's supposed to be. Now I believe that I can be, or I can see, I can try to do what's right. Oh, 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 oh. When I was young and so in love, all that I could see was right in front of me. But you had a plan with us in mind. You had a plan for me, and now I see. Oh, 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 oh,
She's an 8-year-old mare, no injuries off the track, and right now we're just working on flat work, but I think she'd make a really flashy hunter prospect. She knows how to free jump. She does it really, really well. Very cute form, nice and square, tucks her front legs under. Right now for flat work, we're just working on the walk trot, and we're doing a little bit of canter. But she's an easy horse to ride. I would suggest probably an intermediate rider and up. She can have a little bit of an attitude and test ride her a little bit, but once she knows you know how to ride, it's fine. But she has very, very few movements. She's pretty quiet. And she's just learning how to collect as well.
Hi, the Mudbrooker here. In 1792, the United States had a problem. Our nation lacked legitimacy on the world stage. The great powers of Europe all assumed that this cockamamie idea that the right to rule comes from the consent of the governed and the will of the people rather than a divine mandate from an omnipotent deity would soon fall under its own weight, and they would be free to waltz in and pick the carcass for whatever bits they fancied. George Washington was president at the time, and he was keenly aware of this. Frank Zappa once said, "All you need to have your own country is your own beer and an airline." While that's certainly true, Frank left out the most important thing you need to have a country, your own coinage. And while ideas for a monetary system for the United States have been floating around since the Revolutionary War, Congress had never got around to actually enacting any sort of laws to that effect. But after considerable pressure from President Washington and Thomas Jefferson, on the 2nd of April, Congress passed the Mint Act of 1792. The Mint Act established a decimal system of currency for the United States. It set the weight and fineness of the coins, and it also appropriated money to build a mint facility, purchase the equipment needed, appoint officers, and hire workmen. By late June of 1792, the workmen had been hired, the equipment purchased, and the officers of the mint had been appointed. President Washington was extremely eager for coinage to finally begin. He decided that the first coins that the mint would produce should be coins of small denomination. They would produce half dimes. The thinking was that a coin of small denomination would receive the greatest possible circulation in the channels of commerce, and the most citizens possible would come into contact with them and see that the government of the United States was legitimate and meant business. The soundness of this idea is attested to by the fact that of the 300 or so 1792 half dimes that still exist today, all but a very few of them show signs of heavy wear from years of circulation. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. Like I said, Washington was eager to commence coinage, but there were two major obstacles in his path. First was that the mint building wouldn't be completed for at least another year. So Washington overcame this obstacle by ordering the mint equipment be set up in the basement of a sawmaker's shop on Cherry Street in Philadelphia. The other major obstacle was the fact that the mint didn't have any bullion from which to make coins. And it's here that the historical record gets a little bit fuzzy. According to tradition, Washington himself donated the bullion from which to produce the coins. All told, in 1792, 1,500 half dimes were produced by the United States Mint during the first week of July. The story comes from a man named Adam Eckfeldt. Eckfeldt was one of the workers hired in 1792 by the Mint, and he stayed on for the rest of his career. By the time he retired, he had risen to the position of chief coiner. And in 1844, he related the story of the production of the 1792 half dimes to a Treasury official whose name escapes me right now. Now, Eckfeldt is generally considered to be a reliable source, but since he told this story at least 50 years after the fact, and the fact that there's no other corroboration for the story, there is some doubt as to whether or not Washington actually did donate the money. However, Thomas Jefferson made a note in his household journal on the 17th of July, 1792, that he had received delivery of the 1,500 half dimes that were made in the first week of July. At the time, the Mint had a policy that was known as free coinage. If you deposited a certain amount of bullion with the Mint, you would receive in exchange an equal value of newly minted coins. And since Jefferson makes note of taking delivery of these coins, it would logically follow that he was the one who actually made the deposit. Now, of these 1,500 coins, it is known that Washington gave several of them as gifts to visiting dignitaries. Some were given as presentation pieces to various members of Congress, but the vast majority of them were simply dumped into circulation. Now, whether it was Jefferson or Washington who provided the bullion isn't really nearly as important as the simple fact that somebody did. The face value of 1,500 half dimes comes out to $75. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money in today's standards, but when you consider the fact that in 1792 the average wage for an American worker was about $1 a week, $75 represents roughly a year and a half's worth of workmen's wages, and that'll come into play a little bit later on in this video. Washington and Jefferson were both very wealthy men. They were firmly in the 1% of their day and age. However, their fortunes, and indeed their very lives, were inextricably linked with the success of the United States. If the United States failed, at best they would lose everything they had. At worst, they would more than likely be hung for treason. It wasn't until after the War of 1812 that the United States was secure enough that that was no longer a threat. The majority of Washington and Jefferson's money came from farming. In order to make money farming, you have to spend a lot of money. There's considerable investment in land, tools, machinery, equipment, and labor involved in farming, so that money went into general circulation in the rest of the economy and ultimately benefited everybody in the nation by growing the economy. So let's skip forward a couple of centuries and a couple of decades to 2012 and introduce ourselves to Willard Mitt Romney and his wife Ann. Hi Mitt, hi Ann. Mitt Romney is a man who wants desperately to be the next president of these United States. And like Washington and Jefferson, Mitt Romney is firmly amongst the 1% of our day and age. But unlike Washington and Jefferson, Romney's fortune didn't come from creating jobs and growing the economy. His fortune came from destroying jobs and destroying the economy. Should the United States fail, Mitt Romney would lose very little. His fortune lies mostly in offshore bank accounts where it benefits absolutely nobody except Mitt Romney. It doesn't provide any jobs. It does not contribute to the growth of the American economy. If the United States were to fall, all Mitt would have to do is leave the country, and he doesn't lose a damn thing. One of the many things that Mitt Romney and his wife own is a dressage horse. Dressage is an equestrian event where a horse and rider dance and prance around a ring for points. Now, apparently this is quite a good dressage horse because it has qualified for this year's Olympics. Now, horses at one time were essential to the United States economy, but nowadays, with the exception of horses owned by the Amish and a few ranches, they are essentially useless pets. Very expensive useless pets. Now, this pet horse that the Romneys have is owned by them in partnership with another wealthy person. In 2010, the Romneys' share of the care and feeding of this horse came to $77,000. Nowadays, since the median income for the average American family of 4 is about $50,000 a year, $77,000 represents roughly a year and a half worth of workmen's wages. And it's here that we come to the essential difference between Mitt Romney and someone like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. With a nation in crisis and a year and a half worth of workmen's wages in their hands, Jefferson and Washington donated that money to the United States in order to build our nation, in order to give our nation legitimacy and overcome the problems that we were facing. Now here we are in 2012. Hard times come around again and the nation is once more facing a crisis. The question is, what would Mitt Romney do with a year and a half worth of workmen's wages in his hand? Well, he'd stick it back in his pocket, of course, and dump the expense of keeping his useless fucking status symbol pet on the American taxpayer by writing it off as a business expense. And while his horse is receiving what amounts to federally subsidized health care and welfare, Mitt Romney has the unmitigated gall to stand in front of the American public and tell us that none of us deserve health care unless we ourselves pay for it. I think what I'll do next time I come across one of these moronic fucking Tea Partiers wearing a tri-cornered hat holding a badly spelled, grammatically incorrect sign which declares them and their corporate overlords to be the only true inheritors of the mantle of the Founding Fathers, I'm going to walk up to him and punch him as hard as I can right between the fucking eyes. And as he lays there on the ground, dazed and bleeding, I'm going to get comfortable by placing my left foot and a goodly portion of my not inconsiderable body weight in the center of his chest, and I'm going to regale him with the story of the 1792 half-dime, and I'm going to explain to him what somebody who is actually worthy of being the President of the United States does with a year and a half's worth of workman's wages. I'm hoping that maybe the pain and lack of oxygen will open enough of a crack in the wall of stupidity in which these people enclose themselves that my message will get through.